Welcome to another day of Hug Life. Here we go, beginning the last half of our fifth unit, looking at political geography, how you go from being a culture to a nation to actually becoming a state, or as we in America like to call them, a country. So let's go ahead and begin. It's a lovely day. I hear the beautiful sound of a state reopening because there's traffic in the background. So here we go. All right, so we're going to look at an introduction to territory and statehood in the second part of Unit 4, and then we're going to look at borders, types of borders, what determines borders, geopolitics, and how we govern ourselves within these states. So, pencils ready? Here we go. So, in introduction, let me get me out of the way because who wants to see this mug in the morning? All right, territory and sovereignty we're going to begin with. Then we're going to look at states, nations, and nation states. Don't worry, it'll only be slightly less confusing. Then we're going to look at the challenges facing states, modern challenges. And then we're going to look at one of the unfortunate byproducts of state building and of nationalism, and that is colonialism. That's how we'll end our discussion. So let's continue. Now, how does where you are from and where you live identify who you are? This is such an AP Human Geography question because it embraces all the key core tenets and concepts of AP Human Geography. The why of the where. But why and how is it that living in North Carolina, especially if you were born and raised here, defines and identifies who you are? Or from a more from a different scale. If you're born and raised in the South, how does that identify you? If you're born and raised in America, how does that identify you? Heck, if you're of Earth, how does that identify you? So this is just sort of the natural outgrowth of where we've been. All the steps we've taken have gotten us to this point as to who we are and what it means to be, well, a Sandersonian, a Raleighan, a North Carolinian, or an American. What is political geography? Anyone? It's the study of the relationship between people, political units, and then territories at various scales. Again, political geography can be local, could be as small as an HOA, a housing ordinance that says everybody must have the same mailboxes, or there's no soliciting, or your yards have to be clean. That's political. The group that decides if you live in an area that has an HOA, I do, and you know, what are the pool rules, those kinds of things, all the way to the school. The school is a political unit. It's an entity. I mean, if you think about it, it's a formal region. It has defined. It's a state if you want to even go that route. It has defined borders. There's a defined culture. There is a government in place. So, um, as small, heck, as small as your house to as large as the planet or a country, what is the relationship between the people and the political entity in that space? How does scale manifest itself in political geography? Well, again, I gave you some examples, and now we're going to go ahead and give you the terms that coincide with these examples, because the influence of politics or of government on you is relative to the size of the entity. All right. There is the supranational scale. And remember, supra is above. This is the study of organizations like the EU or OPEC or the OAS. Anybody know what that is? Or the agreement formerly known as NAFTA. Um, it's things like that. It's a large scale entity where there are multiple states under the umbrella of one central sort of governing body, and the EU is an excellent example. Our next is the country scale, and that's America. Um, how does a country's government interact with its people? How well organized is it? How if you remember from the practice FRQ about Germany, um, Germany is a federated state. And what does that mean with respect to, as I just realized, some people may still want to take it. What does that mean with respect to government and government organization? And yeah, things of that sort. And then there's the local scale. And again, for those of you who are wondering, that is Red Square, that is Moscow. Um, Local scale can be when you move within a state. Typically anything geopolitically within the borders is local government to varying degrees. You can be more local or less local. But anything from counties to voting districts to court districts to police jurisdictions, which is typically a city, things like that. Those are local scale geopolitical entities. All right, questions? I'm in Russia. Okay, now we're going to look at a couple of key terms that I mentioned and were brought up towards the end yesterday when we were talking about um, countries being countries and being seen as countries, or how nations are viewed once they get borders. And that's what we're talking about here. Territory is the actual place that you control, that you say is mine, is my space. And this is also scalable, as you'll see here shortly. Sovereignty is the ability for you to control your space. It's your power without outside influence to make decisions for your space. And again, in varying scales. And then legitimacy is other people, if it's individuals, individual states or individual countries, acknowledging your right to control your space. That's legitimacy. All right. So now we'll just go over those again. Territoriality is the effort to control a piece of earth. Again, of any scale. It's as small as my personal space. That is an example, as you'll see, of territoriality, because I'm good here. You don't need to be here. And culture influences how much is personal space. In America, we are much less this than other places because we have more room, and we like our space. Whereas in some cultures, where space is limited either because of geography or because of economics, and you have many more people in one place, they're much more hi, how you doing, and so that's a byproduct of culture, and that influences what territory is mine. And again, a nice question that comes from this is, how can this be the basic form of power? So how can you say that territory, the concept of territory, is sort of the most basic root? I don't want to use hearth, but sort of the nexus of power. Anyone? It's a cool question. You can pause the slide here for a second and think about it. Um, During the next few days of office hours, any questions that come up during the notes, write them down now and then share them. Again, we'll have office hours soon, tomorrow. So go ahead and write any questions you have down. But that's a cool question to discuss. Now, examples of territoriality. Ugh, I thought epidemiological was hard. This is looking at size. Okay, not specific examples with respect to like, you know, Morocco or things like that, but the scale of territoriality is what we're looking at here. And like I said before, the first is personal space, and this is what we claim as our own psychological territory. This is function. It could be either a functional region or it could be a what's the other one? Come on, help me. Think an answer. It'll come through the computer, and I'll know it. You know, like the South. Duh, that's right. That's what it is. Good. Um, so it's not formal because there's no defined space, but it's how, at what point is somebody encroaching in your psychological nation, so to speak. The next one is own spaces, and again, that's your house. It could be your room. It could be your car, but it's where this is mine. This is literally legally mine, my own personal space. Own space. Personal space is psychological. Personal space technically can't be owned. Own space is anything that legally recognized by a state entity, by a government entity, is your space. Car, things like that. All right. We're getting bigger. So what do you think is next? Good. If you said political space, excellent. This is areas where we claim to own political power, where our government or our decisions reach. That is political space. So imagine Britain's political space in 1850. That's pretty cool. Um, Also worth knowing that political space also goes into spheres of influence when we think about China and its history in the 19th century, or I don't want to go too much into the weeds, but maybe you could make the argument that culture is a projection of political space. I don't know. That'd be a cool conversation to have. Apple, Coca-Cola, things like that. Is economic imperialism a byproduct of this? I don't know, but it'd be cool to talk about. So, what do we need to control a territory? How can we say that this is mine, and how can we determine what is mine, and how can we get people to recognize this as mine if I'm a government or you're a government? Okay, two things. They the words didn't show up. Okay, one is legitimacy. That's so funny. Uh, anyway, the power that a government has to control its own territory, that's a term. You should know that from world history. You're definitely going to know that next year in A Push or American history. So the left, the blue box, is sovereignty, and the gray box, the recognition that power by of that power by other countries, that's legitimacy. So I have to be able to govern myself without someone else governing me, and someone else has to recognize me as a legitimate governing body. And remember, I said this in our last note section that everybody doesn't have to legitimize you, but as long as you are, you're good. Because remember, Israel's not recognized, Taiwan's not recognized, Kosovo is not recognized by every country in the world, but they are recognized as legitimate by others, so they exist. Sort of like if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it. Based on this theory, it didn't fall. All right. Some countries exercise sovereignty in ways others don't like, but they're still legitimate because people recognize them. So you don't have to like them for them to be legitimate. You just have to acknowledge, yeah, okay, they're kind of jerky, and I disagree with them, but there they are. And that is the great leader. That's the original. That's the first. That's the current leader, Kim Jong Un's grandfather, the man who started the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And it's a fascinating story. Some countries are considered legitimate by some and not by others. Hello, Israel. I need my stylus because I get to draw. Okay, what's that? Anybody? Anybody know what that is? Come on, work. There it is. What's that? Anybody? It's kind of religious. It's kind of important. And there's another thing too. Holy cow! Two important religious sites in one picture. What a coup! Victory. Okay, I'll use coup. All right. Anyway, Dome of the Rock, Western Wall. No? Anyone? Last unit? Okay. Countries are considered to be internally legitimate. In other words, existing from within when we say, yes, you can make decisions that affect our lives. This is part of, oh gosh, I wish we were in class. This would have been an excellent way to get points. Um, this is part of the whole idea of social contract, where we give up part of our freedoms to allow government to make choices for our best interests. So if we allow the government to do things for our lives, then what we are saying is that okay, we recognize you as being you're a legitimate government, go ahead. So by allowing our government to do stuff, we make ourselves legitimate from within, which you kind of need first, I would argue, before you worry about external legitimacy. Questions? All right. Make sure you're eating breakfast, especially Tuesday. Does any state or country, again, see, I like to thank this person for making these notes and helping Americans out by putting country in brackets or parenta things or whatever next to the word state. Do we have complete sovereignty? Does any state have complete and utter, absolute, because complete and absolute are synonymous, sovereignty? Thoughts? That's a good pondering thing right there. All right. Section B. States, nations, nation states. Three different things. Bear with me. All right, here we go. Was is a state. North Carolina is a state. Connecticut is a state. Even South Carolina is a state. But I say that with love. Remember, I grew up there. Um, but that's not what we're talking about here. State, like our previous slide, country. State and country. All right. A state is a political unit with a permanent population. It's a sovereign territory, which means we have a group of people who live here on a regular basis. Sure, there could be migration, there could be net in, there could be net out migration, but there is a group here that is relatively permanent. And that group governs itself. And that group has an effective government and a working economy. And that group that governs itself, that has a government that works and an economy that works, is recognized by other states. Not all, just some. Have all four of these components, your country, you're a state. Yay! You get to raise taxes, have a cool flag. Um, my class needs a flag. Anyway, so that's a state or country. That's what you have to have. So, um, so then what's a nation? Because you hear the word nation thrown out all the time in the news. For those of you who watch the news or read the news or things of that sort. But what is it? What's a nation? I bet you we're going to find out here in a second. I'm back. Okay. The history of a state. So, how states became states. And the concept and the idea of a state is what we're alluding to, not how a state becomes a state. That's a legal process or a military one, depending on how far you want to go in history or how you want to approach things. But the idea of the state, where, what's its origin? Here we go again. So, up until the 1500s, most political power was contained in large borderless empires. Oh, look, it's conquistadors and probably Aztecs. We'll just say indigenous peoples because it's all relatively, unfortunately, the same. Or there were city states, which we'll get into in a second, or there were tribal systems, which were again were regions that didn't necessarily have fixed borders, and there were feudal areas, and that's again hearkening to world history in the days of the manor and feudalism and the fall of the Roman Empire. So up until the 1500s, oh my goodness, that's like exploration and colonization and all that kind of fun stuff. Up until Europeans got better boats and cooler weapons and navigational tools and stuff. But the idea of a country was not a thing. It was just empires. You think of Rome, various Muslim empires, various Chinese empires, even indigenous empires or different Native American nations. They have an area, but it's not fixed. The borders aren't necessarily fixed from the standpoint of they were continuing to grow, especially in the concept of empire. There was always the desire for more, and there are reasons for that. When we in world history, perhaps you discussed, or maybe in the future you discuss, the idea of imperialism and having colonies is actually very, very expensive, and you kind of have to have more, and you have to treat the locals um, disadvantageously because you're trying to maximize profit. So it's always growing and always growing. The idea of this is mine and I'm going to carve it out and I'm just going to rule this. This is going to happen moving forward from the 1500s. The first example of true states were ancient city states in Mesopotamia, like Sparta and Greece. Now, I don't consider Sparta and Greece to be Mesopotamian, so I take issue with this. Um, Sparta and Greece are now, or Sparta in Greece. Um, this should be city states in Mesopotamia or Sparta in Greece. Some of the Mesopotamian city states were true, but Sparta, again, was a city state. Athens was a city state. Corinth was a city state. Basically, it's a large city, and then the land around it that it controls. That's the state. So it's the city itself and whatever it can control politically. That's a city state. These are sort of they're like micro countries in a way. Large land based empires were common, like I said, in South America and Asia, um, more so than in Europe because China was more developed. Um, because in the Americas there was no contact with other people. Europe had to deal with the plague and Rome falling and various groups looking for resources, and so um, historically, geographically, developmentally, Europe's not at a place for empires pre 1500s. The idea, plus, I mean, in the fall of the Roman Empire, England doesn't exist. There's no Germany. There's not France yet. So these places don't even exist. Period. Much of Africa and North America were controlled by individual tribal groups or clans or native indigenous peoples. And again, the area would be limited to what they could control from other people. If they expanded, it was probably for food. Most conflict back then would be over resources, would be over food or hunting grounds or farmland. Again, going back to our ethnic cleansing and genocide from previous classes, the Darfur region uh, was over farming land, was over lands. Much of Europe was comprised of feudal or monarchical empires. Some king, remember feudalism, um, there's a social hierarchy, um, the king, the lords, the knights, the vassals, or the knights, or the vassals, or and the vassals and the lords, interchangeable. Knights, peasants, serfs. Uh, Serfs are part of the land. They provide the food and the farming and the work for the lord and for the knights who own sub parcels of the land. And in return, they are protected and given food and have a place to live after the Roman Empire falls. Because when the Roman Empire falls, it's scary. What caused the rise of the modern state? And by modern state, in this case, we're talking about colonization, the exploration, the era of exploration is over, and this is heading into the 17th century. This is heading into the time of the birth of America and things like that. All right, one of the most important events in European history, and I have always argued the beginning of the First World War, um, was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. Um, Prior to this treaty, there were lots of little tiny states in Europe, in Northern Europe. Germany is divided into hundreds. And um, what they do is they draw these things up and basically they become little sovereign entities responsible for establishing their own trade and their own currency and their own laws. Prior to this, as it says here at the bottom, who you were and the territory in which you resided was set apart by the people within it. So culture and society was sort of you're now entering this group, you're now entering this group. After the Peace of Westphalia, um, the land itself becomes the more important factor, and now that society has this land, and you are now entering Storyville or Weaverton or I don't know, Edmondson or whatever. So the various peoples now become part of this area, and we are now eventually Germans or French or Prussians or whatever. We are now our culture is tied to the land, so it's a shift because of this. And you have a bunch of different places with a bunch of different currencies and a bunch of different laws, and This is sort of one of the precursors of the idea of the state, the country, formally set up. I always do that. The rise of nationalism also changes attitudes about what a state is. Again, I am, and we'll use Germany. I am German. I am of the German peoples. This is my land. I am an American. This is my land. Remember, or maybe knowing this for the first time, American English becomes American English because of Mr. Webster. We get our independence, and then England in 1812 tries to woo us back, with look, you're never going to find anybody like us again. And we know you're struggling. And we're really not the same without you. So, come on back. And we say no. So they burn our house down. And they get all mad. But we just say no. And then they go away. And then we're like, you know what? We're our own people. We're America with a capital A. So Mr. Webster says we need to have our own dictionary, our own words, our own English. And so American English comes about because of that, because of this idea that we're special and we're not English, we're American. So the concept of that um, comes about, and the border now matters even more. That makes sense. Again, any questions? Write them, save them. The European impact on the non-European world helped shape how states are formed worldwide. This is true. In other words, imperial, getting a little better. Imperialism. Europe putting its flags all over the continent, and then carving out, say, okay, here, this little border right here, this little rectangular piece of land right here, that's England. Anything else, you do what you want, that's England. But these borders are drawn in the Americas, in um, Asia to an extent, in Southwest Asia definitely, and in Africa. And these borders, when colonialism ends, and we'll get to it, aren't removed. The overthrow of colonial powers, called decolonization, has created more states than anything else. So more countries have been formed by independence movements or by the colonial powers just being like, I'm out, than anything else, than any kind of, hey, let's make a country. Um, but that's not going to happen unless the people wanting to do this are drawn together by commonalities of culture or of ethnicity. Like those have to be there for this event, for this action to occur. But it's through this action, it's through kicking somebody out, an occupier out, or excuse me, having an occupier say, "No, I'm good. It's too expensive. It's not worth it." That creates more countries than anything else. But you've got to have that. But the more successfully created states are the ones whose ethnicity and whose government and whose structure is very organized and very structured and very, very united. Countries that are struggling, African countries that are struggling successfully, are ones that had rival groups. Going back to yesterday, and the inability to coalesce behind one identity is what leads to the problem because the borders are fixed. Part of it. All right. Uh, all right. This is cool. Okay. We're going to pause here for a second and try and figure out why this isn't working. Um, when I get it figured out, I'll come back. So we'll stop here for now. I'll upload this and then we'll continue later. Thanks.